They looked like a power couple, young, attractive, in love, but behind closed doors, they were building something monstrous, not a future, but a crime scene. Before the headlines called them Canada's Ken and Barbie killers, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were just another couple blending into suburban life. No one could have imagined what was really happening behind their front door, or how far they were willing to go for control, pleasure, and blood. Paul Bernardo didn't come from nowhere. His childhood was shaped by violence, secrecy, and twisted family rituals. He grew up in Scarborough, Ontario, in a home ruled by a father whose cruelty left deep scars, not just beatings, but abuse that fractured his family from the inside. His sister was sexually assaulted by their own father. His mother was reduced to silence and survival. And at night, while most boys were asleep, Paul's father would slip out into the dark and stalk the windows of young girls. Paul learned by watching, but instead of recoiling from the horror, he absorbed it, learned how to wear a smile while hiding a darker hunger. As he got older, he mastered charm. He joined the Scouts, became a trusted counselor, even earned admiration. But what the world saw was only surface. Behind that polished exterior, something else was festering. Then came Karla Homolka. Blonde, soft-spoken, seemingly innocent. But that's the terrifying part. Together, they didn't just hurt people. They recorded it, planned it, gift-wrapped horror in normalcy. Their crimes weren't spontaneous, they were orchestrated, chilling, and their first victim was family. This is not just a story of serial murder. It's a descent into psychological manipulation, obsession, and the terrifying ease with which two people can become one another's worst influence. And the most disturbing part? One of them walked free. This is True Crimes Retells, and today we unravel one of Canada's darkest cases, the twisted love story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, a tale where trust becomes a weapon and innocence is destroyed behind a mask of love. If you're drawn to true stories that explore the darkest corners of the human mind, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Karla a victim of control or a willing partner in every step of the horror? Because sometimes evil doesn't knock, it holds your hand. By the time Paul Bernardo was 16, his world had already been shaped by violence, dysfunction, and secrets. But nothing prepared him for the truth he uncovered that year, a truth that shattered what little foundation he had left. The man he had grown up calling Dad wasn't his father at all. Paul's mother had been unfaithful. She'd had an affair with another man, and Paul was the result. A child born of betrayal. A reminder of a moment she tried to bury. When Paul learned this, something inside him shifted. The revelation didn't just leave him angry, it left him hollowed out. In his eyes, his mother was no longer just a victim of abuse. She became the source of humiliation, disgust, and rage. From that moment, Paul's bitterness turned toward women in general. Not just frustration, hatred. He began feeding a twisted fantasy life filled with violent domination, humiliation, and control. These weren't just passing thoughts. They were growing obsessions, fantasies that blurred into intentions. In his early adult years, Paul got a job at Amway, a multi-level marketing company known for flashy promises and aggressive sales tactics. But Paul wasn't just chasing money, he was studying people. Obsessed with control, he devoured books on persuasion, manipulation, and psychological tactics. He learned how to read vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. Books on sales techniques turned into guides on how to manipulate women. Motivational speaking turned into grooming. Pickup artistry became predation. And Paul wasn't just practicing these skills in the office, he was testing them out in real life. He began targeting women who were quiet, compliant, or emotionally dependent. He wanted submission, control, someone he could mold and break at will. Public humiliation, degrading games, violent sexual acts, it all became part of a routine, and the more control he gained, the darker his urges became. Then in the summer of 1987, at just 22 years old, Paul Bernardo crossed the line from fantasy into full-blown horror. It started with a young woman, 21 years old, walking home from work late at night around 1 a.m. She was just steps from her front door when Paul crept up behind her. Without warning, he dragged her to the ground and unleashed a brutal, sustained assault. For nearly half an hour, he beat her and violently raped her, both vaginally and anally, right outside her home. Days later, he struck again. This time, the victim was 19. She too was walking home alone in the early hours of the morning. Just like before, she was moments from safety when Paul attacked. He tackled her from behind, forced her into her own backyard, and pulled a knife. He pressed it to her throat and whispered that if she made a sound, he'd kill her. Then came the rope. He tied it around her neck, threatening and strangling her with every movement she made. The attack was prolonged over an hour of terror, pain, and humiliation. When he was finished, Paul tied her wrists and secured her by the neck to a fence post before disappearing into the night, leaving her broken but alive. These weren't crimes of passion. They were cold, calculated, controlled. Paul wasn't just assaulting women. He was perfecting a process, a method of psychological and physical domination that thrilled him more than anything else in his life. And just months later, he met someone who wouldn't run from that darkness. He met Karla Homolka. At first glance, Karla's childhood seemed far less volatile than Paul's. There were no reports of severe abuse, no family members committing unspeakable crimes. But that doesn't mean everything was stable. Karla remembered nights when her father would drink too much and explode into rages. Screaming matches would break out between her parents, violent, terrifying episodes. She and her sisters would huddle together in fear, hoping it would pass. So when Karla met Paul, charming, confident, and assertive, she didn't run, she leaned in. What started as a fast-moving romance would soon spiral into something else entirely. A partnership where cruelty and manipulation weren't just tolerated, they were shared. This wasn't the end of Paul's violence. It was just the beginning, and now he had someone to help him hide it. As Karla Homolka moved through her teenage years, signs of something unsettling began to emerge beneath the surface. She wasn't the typical small-town girl. There was a darkness forming, subtle at first, but deeply rooted. While other girls were discovering music, friends, and crushes, Karla's interest took a different turn. She developed a strange fixation on death, crime, the occult. She would hold mock seances with her friends, pretending to contact spirits and speak with the dead. What might have seemed like harmless teen curiosity took a more disturbing turn when, during one of these get-togethers, Karla did something no one forgot. She threw her friend's pet hamster out of a window. The small creature died instantly. She laughed. Some brushed it off as a twisted prank, but others saw it for what it was, a warning. One of her ex-boyfriends later revealed that Karla was obsessed with the idea of dying. Not just death, but the experience of being killed. She would cut herself with knives, not as a cry for help, but as an experiment, a way to feel something, or maybe to numb something else. At the time, it was easy to write off as teenage rebellion or attention-seeking. But in hindsight, these were flashing red signs. There was something inside Karla that wasn't quite like the others, something colder, more detached, something that would later make her the perfect accomplice. Unlike Paul's previous girlfriends who recoiled from his twisted fantasies, Karla didn't run. She didn't scream, she leaned in, encouraged it, fed it. Paul was evolving into something darker, more dangerous, and Karla didn't just accept it, she adapted to it. He started to mold her, telling her what to wear, how to style her hair, what kind of makeup to apply. At first it seemed like controlling behavior, but soon it was more than that. He chipped away at her identity, breaking her down until she was exactly what he wanted, compliant, obedient, emotionally numb. He stripped away her independence, cutting her off from friends and family, until she existed only for him. But Karla wasn't the reason Paul stopped attacking strangers. In fact, he never stopped. While Karla played the devoted girlfriend, Paul was still prowling the streets at night hunting. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul is confirmed to have attacked at least 16 different women. But investigators believe the real number is closer to 25. Many of his victims never came forward. Some couldn't. Each attack followed a chilling pattern, and each time he escalated the cruelty. Paul had a specific type: young, petite, often between 14 and 20. He preferred those who looked innocent, vulnerable. His hunting grounds were bus stops, quiet neighborhoods, dimly lit paths where women walked alone. He would stalk them, wait until they passed, then strike from behind. The attack was swift. He'd knock them down with violent punches to the back of the head or shoulders, then drag them somewhere secluded, a backyard, an alley, or behind a fence. Once alone, he'd tie a rope around their neck and use it as a leash, tightening it when they resisted. Sometimes he'd press a knife to their throat and whisper that if they screamed, he'd kill them. Then the assault would begin. Paul's violence wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. He would beat them repeatedly. Sometimes he'd punch their legs, backs, ribs. On one occasion, he twisted a girl's arm so violently that he fractured the bone. Another time, he used the blade of his knife to violate a victim, internally slicing her so severely that her uterus was lacerated. But Paul didn't just want control over their bodies. He wanted control over their minds. He made his victims speak during the assault, forced them to say humiliating things, made them repeat that they wanted it, that he was the best they'd ever had, that they loved him. He wanted to hear it not because he believed it, but because it fed his ego, his dominance. Sometimes he inserted sticks, twigs, or foreign objects during the attack. He'd force their faces into the dirt while running the knife up and down their back, savoring every second of their fear. It wasn't just rape. It was ritualistic degradation. Each victim was a performance, a rehearsal, and Paul was perfecting his role as a sadist. And Carla, she knew. The death of 15-year-old Tammy Homolka was a tragedy that should have shattered her family. Instead, it became a secret buried beneath a polished surface, a dark truth cloaked in smiles, sympathy, and silence. After the funeral, Carla and Paul didn't withdraw. They didn't show signs of guilt. If anything, they appeared closer than ever. It was as if Tammy's death had fused them together, not in grief, but in shared depravity. To the outside world, they were a young couple planning a wedding. Behind closed doors, they were sharpening their methods, building on what they'd already gotten away with. And Paul had tasted what it felt like to kill without consequence. In essence, Tammy's death had emboldened him. The Scarborough rapist, as the media now called him, wasn't slowing down. In fact, his attacks grew more frenzied, more violent, and more frequent. The darkness that had haunted the streets of Scarborough at night was growing teeth. Paul's approach was disturbingly methodical. He would stalk his victims, usually teenagers, sometimes young women who just looked young. He knew their habits, their bus stops, their routines, and then he'd wait. The attacks would start with a surprise grab, a punch, a knife, something to break their sense of safety. He'd drag them to a secluded spot behind a school, a wooded area, an alley always close enough to home that the victim had just let their guard down. And then the nightmare would begin. Each assault lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 excruciating hours. Paul was patient, calculated. He didn't just want control, he wanted fear. He'd sometimes pretend to leave, giving his victims a fleeting hope that it was over, only to return moments later and start again. That false moment of relief made the second wave of terror even worse. And when he was finally done, he rarely left empty-handed. He would take something, not money or jewelry, but personal tokens, a student ID, a driver's license, something with a photo, a piece of their identity, a way to revisit the attack in his mind again and again. By now, police were starting to piece it together. The similarities between the cases, the method, the timing, the descriptions made it clear. A serial predator was hunting the women of Scarborough. The media gave him a name, the Scarborough rapist, and the warning spread fast. Women were told not to walk alone, to be vigilant, but still, he kept striking. Then came May 26, 1990. A 19-year-old woman was walking behind a school when Paul attacked her. The violence he unleashed on her was horrifying. Over an hour of torture, sexual assault, and cruelty. And when he was finished, he didn't just leave. He reached down, and tore out a handful of her pubic hair. A trophy, a part of her to keep. But this time he made a mistake. The victim had gotten a clear look at his face. She described him in vivid detail, and with her help, police were able to build a composite sketch one that looked eerily accurate. Not long after, two separate people saw the sketch in the paper and thought of the same man, Paul Bernardo. One was a bank employee, the other was Tina Smirnis, the wife of one of Paul's close friends. Both contacted the authorities. Finally, it seemed like police were on the right track. They brought Paul in for questioning. He didn't resist. He sat calmly, spoke politely, gave them a DNA sample without hesitation. He even admitted that he did resemble the sketch with a casual shrug, like it was nothing. But then, the investigation took a baffling turn. Paul was charming, soft-spoken, confident. He looked more like a motivational speaker than a monster, and the officers, convinced by his demeanor, decided that this couldn't possibly be their guy. A serial predator wouldn't be this composed, this likable. They dismissed Tina's tip, assuming she might just be after the reward money. They took the DNA and then shelved it. They didn't even test it, and with that, Paul Bernardo walked out of the police station free. By this time, he was practically part of Carla's family. He was living with them, eating dinner with her parents, and he was still obsessed with Tammy, even after her death. He'd watch old tapes, revisit the memory. And Carla, disturbingly loyal, did everything to keep his obsession alive. She wore her sister's clothes, styled her hair the same. She became a mirror of Tammy, willingly. And Paul wanted more. He began planning again. Not just another assault, something bigger. Something that would bind him and Carla together forever in their shared depravity. But the police weren't entirely done with him yet. That DNA sample, forgotten for now, still sat in storage. And one day, it would speak. It was the early hours of June 15, 1991, and 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey had just missed curfew. Her parents, tired of late nights and broken promises, had locked the door. She stood outside her family home in Burlington, Ontario, stranded in the dark, unsure of what to do next. She was only a few feet from safety, but fate had something else in store. Unbeknownst to her, Paul Bernardo was driving through the neighborhood at that very moment. Just like he'd done so many times before, he was searching. His eyes scanned the quiet streets for a potential victim. Then he spotted her, young, alone, vulnerable. He pulled over. Leslie, frustrated and possibly embarrassed, didn't see danger in the charming stranger. Paul approached casually, offering a cigarette and a bit of conversation, pretending to be kind. She let her guard down, and that's when he struck. In an instant, Paul forced Leslie into his car and drove her straight to the home he now shared with Carla Homolka, his wife, his accomplice, and the only other person who truly knew the horrors he was capable of. The moment they crossed the threshold, Leslie's fate was sealed. Inside that house, the atmosphere shifted. Leslie was tied up, drugged, and degraded. What happened next is almost unspeakable, but it's the reality of who Paul and Carla were behind closed doors. They videotaped themselves torturing her, physically and sexually, while taunting her. The tapes would later reveal a girl in agony. She cried, she begged, she pleaded. Paul and Carla? They laughed. Carla handed him tools. She helped position the camera. She acted as if this was all normal. They had done this before, and now they were doing it again. Only this time, it was with someone else's daughter. Leslie was kept alive for nearly 24 hours. A full day of abuse on tape at the hands of two people who were supposed to represent the face of love, family, and normalcy. Then, she was gone. To this day, it's still debated how Leslie Mahaffey died. Paul claims she choked on her own vomit. Carla insisted Paul strangled her with an electrical cord. Whether it was a cold-blooded murder or an overdose from the drugs they forced into her system, one thing is certain: they didn't try to save her. Instead, they moved on to disposal. Not grief, not remorse, planning. Paul went out and rented a concrete mixer. He bought bags of cement and returned home, where he dismembered Leslie's body with a circular saw in their basement. Her remains were placed into several buckets and coolers, which he then filled with cement. Then, together, they drove to Lake Gibson, about an hour's drive away. Under the stillness of the water, they dumped the blocks, thinking the lake would hold their secret forever. But the lake had other plans. 2 weeks later, on June 29th, the water gave up its dead. A fisherman spotted a strange concrete block, cracked open near the shoreline. Inside was something horrifying: human remains. Divers were brought in, and more cement blocks were pulled from the lake. Each one contained more of Leslie Mahaffey. Investigators were shaken. A young girl missing for 2 weeks, found dismembered and encased in cement. The brutality was unprecedented. The public was terrified. And the worst part? There were no suspects, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no trail to follow. Meanwhile, Paul and Carla? They were watching the news at home, just a short drive from the discovery site. The headlines played like a movie trailer for their own crimes. And they were safe. For now. They still wore smiles in public, still played the role of the sweet, newlywed couple. But in private, they were growing bolder, more dangerous. And they weren't finished. Not even close. April 16th, 1992, the last Thursday of Holy Week. In most homes, people were preparing for the Easter holiday, blissfully unaware of the evil circling their community. But for 15-year-old Kristen French, it would become the day her life was violently stolen. Kristen was walking home from school, just like she always did. She was bright, strong-willed, and carried herself with a quiet confidence. But even the smartest teens don't see monsters coming, not in broad daylight, and not in a church parking lot. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were already parked nearby, waiting. And they weren't just out for a drive. They were hunting again. Carla stepped out first, holding a map in her hand, pretending to be lost. As Kristen approached, she did what most people would do. She stopped to help. What she didn't know was that Paul was already moving in from behind. In a matter of seconds, the scene turned from casual to chaos. Paul grabbed her. She struggled, screamed, but she was overpowered quickly, shoved into the front seat, sandwiched between Paul and Carla. The doors slammed shut, and just like that, Kristen vanished. It happened so fast, yet so methodically. It was clear this wasn't their first time. But Kristen was different from their previous victims. She wasn't unconscious. She wasn't drugged. She was fully aware and fully determined to survive. Back at their home, she was immediately stripped of her school uniform and tied up. Paul and Carla filmed everything as they always did. Except this time, Kristen wasn't going to stay quiet. She fought back. She refused to cower. She stared Paul in the face, called him a bastard. She told Carla she was sick. She resisted every command, every humiliation, and somehow that enraged them even more. For 3 days, Kristen was subjected to repeated rapes, beatings, and unimaginable cruelty. They made her say things on tape, things no child should ever have to utter. They filmed her being violated, degraded, and brutalized. And yet she refused to give them what they wanted most: obedience. In the videos, Kristen's pain is clear, but so is her spirit. Even in the darkest corners of hell, she didn't surrender. But Paul and Carla couldn't allow her to live. She knew their names. She'd seen their faces. She would testify. So on April 19th, Easter Sunday, they made their final decision. They forced her to take a shower, then made her kneel on the floor. Paul wrapped a noose of twine around her neck while Carla held her down. And just like that, after 3 days of torture, they took her life. Her body was dumped like garbage in a ditch in Burlington, not far from a school. Her hair had been crudely hacked short, and she was wrapped in a filthy blanket. But Kristen was not forgotten. Her parents had sounded the alarm within minutes of her disappearance. Friends, family, and even strangers poured into the streets with posters, search parties, and hope. Her face was on every TV screen, every telephone pole. This time, the whole country was watching, and the pressure was mounting. Kristen's murder would prove to be the final unraveling of Paul and Carla's twisted empire of abuse. because they were no longer just shadows in the dark. They were killers who had left too many clues and made too many mistakes. What they didn't realize was that justice was already on their trail. Kristen French had been missing for 3 days. Her school books were still in her backpack. Her dog still waited by the door. And her parents were clinging to hope. But behind closed doors, she was enduring the same nightmare Leslie Mahaffey had suffered, except this time it was even crueler. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka had already decided Kristen would never leave their home alive. They didn't bother blindfolding her. There was no pretense, no mercy, just control, just evil. Back at their house, Kristen was subjected to every depraved act the couple had ever fantasized about. She was drugged with a toxic mix of alcohol and tranquilizers, beaten until she bled, and repeatedly raped. Paul urinated on her. They forced her to perform degrading acts while the camcorder rolled. They humiliated her with a wine bottle and made her say things no child should ever be forced to say, praising the man who was torturing her. But one of the cruelest, most heart-shattering acts, they made her watch. Between assaults, they would turn on the television and play the local news. And there, on the screen, was her father, begging, weeping, pleading with anyone who had seen his daughter to bring her home safe. Imagine the horror of that, being trapped, brutalized, and forced to watch the people who love you most suffer helplessly on the outside. Paul and Carla locked her in a cupboard when they weren't using her. And during those short, silent moments when Paul stepped out of the house, Kristen would turn to Carla and beg to be let go. But Carla never did. On the third day, Paul decided it was time. Kristen was lying on the bed, her hands tied behind her back. She was exhausted, broken, but still alive, still fighting in her own quiet way. Paul got on the bed and mounted her from behind. He wrapped a length of electrical cord tightly around her throat. Carla stood by, silent. Paul leaned close, whispering something into Kristen's ear. Carla later claimed she didn't catch all of it, but she clearly heard Paul say, "What do you know about dying?" And then he pulled. Kristen struggled, her body convulsing, lungs desperate for air. Paul stared at the bedside clock and timed himself. 7 minutes. That's how long it took. He wanted to make sure she was really gone. Afterward, they wrapped her body and dragged it to the basement. And then, because their depravity knew no limits, they cleaned themselves up, changed clothes, and drove over to Carla's parents' home for dinner. They ate a meal, made small talk, smiled, and laughed, while Kristen's lifeless body lay cold and still beneath their floorboards. On April 30th, 1992, Kristen's body was discovered in a ditch roughly 45 minutes from Paul and Carla's house. Her corpse had been carefully washed, her hair completely shaved off, possibly to remove forensic evidence, or to further degrade her even in death. But the truth was beginning to catch up with them. And something strange began to happen. Carla started hearing things. At first, just soft knocks from the basement. Then whispers. Someone calling her name when no one else was home. She became convinced their house was haunted. She even contacted a spiritual medium, desperate to rid the home of whatever evil she believed had taken root there. But maybe what Carla was really hearing wasn't supernatural. It was her guilt. A creeping, growing madness. The echo of the lives she helped destroy. And Paul? He was spiraling too. He became more violent, more unpredictable. The abuse he once reserved for strangers now turned inward. One night he beat Carla so badly her eyes swelled shut. And that, finally, was the breaking point. She fled, running to the home of a family friend. The husband just happened to be a police officer. When he saw her injuries, he took one look and said enough was enough. She was rushed to the hospital, and this time, the police got involved. It was February 1993, and after years of horror, law enforcement finally began connecting the dots. They pulled Paul's DNA sample, the one he'd given 3 years earlier when the Scarborough rapist investigation was still active. And when the results came back, it was him. He was the man they'd been hunting all along. Under interrogation, Carla began to realize her house of cards was crumbling. The police had the DNA, the reports, the statements, the timelines. So she did what she thought would save her. She got herself a lawyer. She struck a deal. She agreed to tell everything in exchange for leniency. And it worked. Paul Bernardo was arrested. Their home was raided. And that's when detectives found something horrifying. A diary, written by Paul in graphic detail. Every rape, every beating, every murder carefully recorded. But the true smoking gun was the tapes. The camcorder Paul and Carla had used to record their crimes had been hidden inside the house. And when police finally recovered the videotapes, they realized something deeply disturbing. Carla hadn't just been a victim. She was an active participant. The footage told a story very different from the one she'd given in court. It showed her laughing, encouraging, taking part in the abuse. There was no sign of fear, no signs she was being forced. But by then, it was too late. Her deal had already been signed. Carla Homolka was sentenced to just 12 years in prison. Paul, on the other hand, had no defense left. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1995, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. But that day has come and gone. His parole was denied in 2018 and again in 2021. And Carla? She served her sentence, and then she walked free. While behind bars, photos of her surfaced, playing in a children's playhouse, riding a rocking horse, a convicted child killer surrounded by symbols of innocence, as if mocking the very lives she helped destroy. In 2005, she was released. Not long after, she married her lawyer's brother and gave birth to 3 children. In 2017, Carla was seen volunteering at an elementary school. The media outrage was so intense she was forced to resign. But the fact that she even had the chance left many speechless. And Paul, he's still in prison, isolated, hated, forgotten. But for the families of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and the unnamed victims who never got justice, there is no release, no deal, no forgetting. There is only the echo of what was taken and the haunting reality that 2 people who looked so ordinary were capable of this. And so, we close the chapter on one of the darkest stories ever told. A story not just of murder, but of manipulation, deceit, and evil hiding behind the mask of ordinary life. Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and the countless unnamed girls who never got justice, their lives were stolen, their names etched into a history written in pain. But their stories must not fade. In the end, justice was only partially served. One of the monsters remains behind bars. The other now walks free, a mother, a wife, her past hidden from those who don't look close enough. And that leaves us with a question, one that might keep you awake tonight. If 2 people like Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka could blend into everyday society for so long, how many more are still out there, unseen? Let that sink in. If you felt the weight of this story, the horror, the heartbreak, the injustice, then you already understand why stories like these must be told. Because silence helps monsters hide. Here at True Crimes Retells, we tell these stories not for shock, but for remembrance. And maybe, just maybe, to stop history from repeating itself. When you share these stories, you don't just spread awareness. You help keep these victims' names alive. You become part of something larger. You become a Retell, someone fearless. Someone who fights so the forgotten are remembered. So if you're still with us, consider this your invitation. Be a Retell. Share this video. Leave a comment. What do you think justice should have looked like? Do you believe Carla Homolka truly changed, or is she simply out of sight, waiting? Subscribe if you haven't already. We release new, chilling stories every week right here on True Crimes Retells. Hit that bell so you never miss one. Because some stories don't just deserve to be told, they need to be heard. Until next time, stay alert, stay aware. And as always, stay relentless.